Hello everybody, welcome to episode 46 of Show For You. We're going to be going over Don Quixote by Miguel De Cervantes. So, just to kind of preface, Don Quixote was a two-part book, yet it is often compiled into a whole book, like we have here with the Penguin Classics edition. Yeah, you see there, the beautiful cover art. I love that scenic view. And I honestly, when it comes to classic books, I always end up going with Penguin Classics because I like the uniformity of the spines, because they always have a nice uniform spine, and then usually some pretty good cover art right there. But, yeah, so this book is usually compiled when it comes to its whole story, but it was technically a two-part book that we had with the first part coming out in 1605 and the second part coming out in 1615. Now, the reason why I decided to read this book is actually considered to be the first modern novel, and I can honestly see where that descriptor is absolutely earned, because this has to be one of the first books that I've read that was a classic that seemed like it was something new. Like I said, this came out in 1605, at least the first part did, and it still holds up to this day. It's a phenomenal book. Now, when it comes to in terms of reading classics, I decided to read this first because the three big classics I've been wanting to read recently are Don Quixote, The Count of Monte Cristo, and War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. And I checked this one out first because it has such renown behind it, and like I said, I believe it's deservedly so. But I'll still have to pick up The Count of Monte Cristo, but I have War and Peace up there on my top shelf, on one of my higher shelves. But yeah, so to preface this book, it honestly, I don't really know how it can be classified. I believe it would best be classified as an adventure novel, and the first part would also be best classified as a comedy, because a lot of it is comedy, but it's also adventure and deeper things. But, yeah, so this book was actually first published in Spanish because, like I said, his name was Miguel De Cervantes, and he was a Spanish man, and he published this, like I said, 1605, and the second part in 1615. So, in the beginning of the book, we were introduced that this is being written by Don Quixote, or Alfonso Quixano. Yeah, Quixano. Alfonso Quixano's stepdad, because, well, I'll get into it later. But, yeah, so this is being told to us in a present tense, but it's his stepdad giving us his own interpretation and translation of a translation by Sid Bengali, who is not a Arabic, but a Moor who originally told the story of Don Quixote. So, the first part of Don Quixote predominantly focuses more on adventure, and it tells the first part, because the Penguin Classics divides the first part actually into, I believe it's 4 parts. And so the first part predominantly focuses on Don Quixote, whose name is actually Alfonso Quixano, and him, who we're introduced to as a very intellectual man who owns a nice piece of land. He's a wealthy hidalgo, and he is a massive fan of books of knight-errantry. And he's read so many of them that he's eventually come to delude himself into becoming a knight-errant himself. So he decides to set out on this grand adventure. And so we see as he first trapezes into the wilderness and is going about and doing all of his chicanery and all that, he runs up on a couple of just random wagons and assages them and just gets into a bunch of chicanery. Because predominantly the big thing with Don Quixote is that he is utterly delusional. Everything he sees has to do with knight-errantry. He sees some, for example, some ruffians on the road, and he's like, those are bandits who have captured some princess. Like, one time he sees these friars transporting a woman so she can go to America. She's transporting her ship, and he's like, you know what, they captured their bandits, and she's a princess. So that's kind of like the main theme throughout all of this, is Don Quixote is seeing things and perceiving them as what they're not. But yeah, so we see as Don Quixote forays out first time, then he ends up coming back home for a little bit to collect some stuff, and then he leaves again. And one of the first major parts in the story is he sees a man who is getting lashings by, well, not lashings, but whips, and just he's tied up to a tree and he's getting beat by his master because he's just not working to the degree that his master wants him to. And Don Quixote comes up and he's like, yo, if you don't pay this dude what he's deserved, then I'm going to come back and I'm going to fight you. And that's kind of the one thing that I mentioned that because it kind of reoccurs and has another plot point later on. Yeah, so eventually on Don Quixote's second foray out, he ends up meeting his squire by the name of Sancho Panza, the best character in this book. I love Sancho because Sancho is almost like a self-insert in a way. Not really a self-insert, but more so a more realistic character in this tale of tomfoolery. Yeah, so we see this, and we see as Don Quixote ends up getting some of his most infamous like little forays where he ends up fighting windmills because he believes they're giants, and he runs straight into them, busts himself up, and all that stuff. So we see as Sancho and him kind of travel along, get into their own stuff, and we see as at one point Sancho, Don Quixote runs into this man who is the people who transporting the woman to go to the Americas, and he runs upon his first duel by this dude who's called the Basque, and we see Don Quixote and the Basque end up jousting and fighting, and Don Quixote actually ends up winning this fight, but he is badly injured as well. But so when we see as they progress along a little bit more, and then eventually him and Sancho end up stopping by an inn. They stop by this inn, and they're just kind of doing their own thing, kind of chilling, and at one point, this woman of the night ends up trying to get another man to partake in her services at one point in the story, and she ultimately ends up going to the room where the men stay in this inn to do her job, and and when she ends up getting in the wrong bed, she gets in the bed with Don Quixote. He like ends up holding her, and she starts going crazy. He's the dude who she's supposed to be with ends up beating Don Quixote. Then everyone just starts fighting. Everything's throwing down. Don Quixote gets busted up pretty bad, and then the priest comes in there. He's like, "What's going on in here?" And yeah, eventually everything is solved. Everything gets calm, and Don Quixote is left, and Sancho got trampled as well, so they're left there. Don Quixote ends up taking this elixir that he says is like cure-all, and he doesn't end up getting dysentery, but Sancho does, and he ends up absolutely blowing out of both ends. And then eventually they stay there for a little bit longer, and they end up leaving, and the innkeeper's like, "Yo, thank you for staying and all that, but can you pay us?" And Don Quixote's like, "Nah, I ain't got the money." So he ends up leaving, but Sancho doesn't end up leaving in time, gets captured, gets not bed tossed, but blanket tossed up in the air like a dog. And, yeah, that it becomes a point of much resentment for Sancho. But, yeah, so, like, okay, I also forgot to mention earlier on in the book when Don Quixote first goes on his first adventure, he ends up stopping at another inn, and he believes it's a castle. Every time he gets to an inn, he believes it's a castle. And he gets the Lord, the innkeeper, to knight him with, I think it's with his own sword. But, yeah, so we just kind of see as they continue to move along. But, yeah, so they move along, and everything goes on. They go on a couple more adventures, and they end up going out into the forest. And, well, eventually when they're in the forest, they end up meeting with this dude by the name of Cardenio. Now, Cardenio has a story for him. Cardenio is perceived to be a knight, even though he's not really a knight. He's out there in the fields. He's just kind of a vagabond. And he tells him a story of this lover who he had by the name of Lucinda. Now, Lucinda, who he had fallen deeply in love with for a long time, had planned to marry him. They had been planning to marry for a while, but eventually Cardenio got sent off to a lord's area, or a lord's land, to kind of act as a friend to the lord's son, Don Fernando. And he ended up going because his dad wanted him to, and he was like, "You can marry when you get back." He ended up going, and him and Don Fernando ended up becoming good friends, and he eventually learns of a tale of Don Fernando ended up actually falling enamored with a woman, and he went and partook with her. They had intercourse, and then Don Fernando ended up leaving and not marrying the woman, though he promised her to. And so he ends up coming back, and eventually Don Fernando learns of Lucinda and Cardenio's love for each other because they're sending letters and all that, and Don Fernando slowly becomes more and more involved with it until eventually he's like, he sends Cardenio off somewhere, and, well, actually Cardenio, he asked to, I believe, transport a letter for Cardenio, and he ends up doing so, and in the, task of doing so, he ends up actually proposing to Lucinda and planning to marry her. Well, during all of this, Cardenio's feeling rightfully betrayed and all that, and we see as him and Lucinda kind of negotiate, and Lucinda's like, "I'm going to either kill myself or we're going to run away together." And so the day of the wedding comes, and Lucinda is to marry Don Fernando, and she is asked to do her vows, and she says she will. And then Cardenio ends up seeing this, and he runs off and goes away. And without seeing that, Lucinda actually ended up fainting, and it was revealed that she had a note in her, her pocket, kind of in her blouse, and talking about how she would kill herself if she had to marry Don Fernando and all that stuff. So Don Fernando actually ends up getting enraged. But after this, we see as Cardenio and Don Quixote are kind of talking and all that. Don Quixote has a brief stint out in the forest, and he then stays there for a little while, and he's like, Sancho, I need you to send this message to Dulcinea del Toboso. That is Don Quixote's like lover, even though he's never even communicated with Dulcinea del Toboso, and Dulcinea del Toboso isn't really that. She is an actual person, but she's not who Don Quixote perceives her to be as. So if Dulcinea del Toboso really even showed up, he wouldn't be able to identify her because his idea of grandeur is way too high for that. But yeah, he sends Sancho off to do this. Sancho ends up not finding the woman, but he ends up coming back, and he actually runs into two good friends of Don Quixote, which are the barber from his name's Master Nicholas. He's the barber, and he runs into the priest from La Mancha, and they end up talking about how they're going to try and save Don Quixote from his madness, because while all this had been going on, they had been at Don Quixote's house trying to console his niece and his like housekeeper and all that, because they were like, he's gone mad and he's gone crazy and he's ran off because of these books of knight errantry. And so they end up burning all the books of knight errantry, well, most of the books of knight errantry, and so this is why they're back here. They're looking for Don Quixote so they can take him back. And so this ends up happening, and Sancho ends up coming back, and while they're on their way, they end up running to a woman by the name of Dorothy. And now Dorothy is Don Fernando's lost lover, well, not lost lover, but betrayed lover. And Dorothy's kind of broken down. That's why she's in the forest, because she ran off. And so eventually she agrees to the plot to lure Don Quixote back toward La Mancha. And so Don Quixote ends up moving along. He agrees to defend Dorothy, because Dorothy claims to be the queen of a land of Nicomia, and it's like Niconcomia or something like that. It's a weird word, but it might be like, I mean, never mind. You get the point. But she claims to be a queen of this land. She needs the help of Don Quixote to free her people, and so they end up going along. And obviously, Master Nicholas and the priest are disguised. And so she's like, you know what, I'll go with you. So they end up going, and Cardenio ends up tagging along too. So they all end up going back toward La Mancha. They end up at the inn again. And while they're at the inn, they end up meeting with this woman by the name of, well, this is right actually later on. But while they're at the inn, they see as like an entourage of people end up coming in. And it's a woman dressed as like in full white, as if she's going to go to a convent to become a nun. And there's this other dude. And once they end up talking with her, they learn that this is Don Fernando and Lucinda. They actually did not end up getting fully married because of the note that Lucinda had, and Don Fernando kind of got outraged, so he sent her off. And so we ultimately see a lovely reuniting of everyone, and Dorothy and Don Fernando end up making amends, and Lucinda and Cardenio are reunited, and everything's good. Now, while they're also further staying at the end, then another group of people end up arriving, and this woman by the name of Zoraida. Now, Zoraida is a Moor who wants to become a Christian. She's a Christian Moor. And now a Moor, just for background information, is a Muslim in Spain. It was during the era prior to the Reconquista. They were often referred to as Moors, even though I don't know why that is, because the area that they lived in was known as Al-Andalusia, but I guess probably just what the Christians referred to them as, the Moorish. But yeah, so she is a Arabic, or of Arabic descent, or whatever you want to say, of Islamic Arabic. Though I know those are different, but yes, she is of not Spanish descent, not Spanish Christian descent, but she is a Christian, and we get to learn her story. Now, this arc is probably my favorite, or my second favorite, because honestly, the entire like Return to the Inn arc is probably like my favorite, I would say, in all of Don Quixote, all 982 pages. But because we get to learn the story of Zoraida. Now, we learned that Zoraida was a princess. And we'll actually learn the story of one of her assistants first. Now, this assistant, he was a mercenary who was a mercenary because his father was a very wealthy man, and he agreed to divide his wealth equally among his sons if they would do certain tasks. One of them was to become a merchant, one of them was to become a scholar and holy man, and one of them was to become a warrior. And he was the oldest, so he decided to become the warrior. And he went about, and he had quite the misfortune on his battles, because he ended up getting captured, and ultimately he was sent to Algiers, and that's just modern-day Algeria. And there, while he was under his captivity, he ended up meeting up with Zoraida, who was the owner of the, I guess, POW camp that he was at, kind of the work camp. And she ends up getting in contact with him. She's like, I want to leave Algiers because I want to go to Spain, become a Christian, I want to get baptized. And so we see as they eventually develop their plot to escape, which they ultimately end up doing, but her dad actually ends up getting involved, and they have to subdue him, and eventually they end up leaving him behind, and they all end up going to Spain, where eventually they run into Don Quixote and crew at the end. So yeah, I just really like seeing that, and we see as the priest actually offers to baptize her, but I don't believe he ever actually does there. But everyone ends up going back up on their own trips. And Dorothy ends up revealing that she's not actually the princess that she was to Don Quixote. So Don Quixote is left with, well, I forgot to mention this, but when Sancho came back to Don Quixote after having met with Dulcinea del Toboso, he ends up telling him that Dulcinea recommended or requested that he come back, really demanded. And so Don Quixote is left to come back to La Mancha as his final goal, because he agreed that he could not solve one problem until the other one was done. So eventually, since Dorothy revealed that she is no longer the princess, then he can now focus on Dulcinea del Toboso. So he ends up coming back, and once they're back in La Mancha, they have a brief stint of, I think it's like 3 or 2 months, where he is left at home to kind of chill and do his own thing, since they revealed to him that, hey, we're trying to get you to come back home and be relieved of your madness. But while they're here, he appears to be slowly recovering from his madness, but he actually does not. He ends up breaking again, and he goes back out on an adventure, taking Sancho with him. Now, Sancho came back, and his wife was okay with it, because throughout this whole thing, he has been along with Don Quixote, because Don Quixote promised him an island, or at least a governorship, and he has not got one lick of that, but he's holding up hope. But he did actually end up getting 100 escudos out of this, and I don't really know how the money was divided at the time. I know escudos, reals, and I don't know if there's another one mentioned. They mentioned farthings too, but I believe that was English currency, or it might have been any currency, I don't know. But yeah, so we see as they come back, Sancho comes back with his 100 reals, and then we go on to part 2. Now, 100 escudos. Now part 2. Now part 2, honestly, it is not as much of a comedy. I actually perceive part 2 as a really sad book. Because, okay, so part 2 starts off, and we see as they're going along, and Sancho and Don Quixote end up going back on an adventure, and they end up getting in some goofy shenanigans beforehand. They end up running into a man who was taking lions to the king of Spain, and Don Quixote's like, you know what, I want to face these lions. So he lets the lions out, and the lion won't come out of the cage, and Don Quixote becomes, crap. You've been known as Don Quixote of the Sorry Face beforehand, because or the Knight of the Sorry Face, because his face was absolutely obliterated after so many like run-ins and all that. But he has another moniker about lions, and it's not mentioned a lot, that's why I don't really remember it. But yeah, he gets his moniker from lions based off his encounter with the lions here. But then they run into someone. They run into the Duke and the Duchess. Now, the Duke and the Duchess, between the events of Don Quixote Part 1 and Don Quixote Part 2, someone actually published the travels of Don Quixote, and it was Sid Bengali. And Bengali published these travels just as a book of knight-errantry, and they became very popular. And the Duke and Duchess know about these travels. They read Part 1, and they know everything. And they are horrible people, because what they do is they falsify travels and adventures for Sancho and Don Quixote to have, because they want to be amused. They don't do it because they're real adventures. They do it to manipulate mentally unwell people to amusing them. Now, this does end up working pretty well for him. Like, we see as Sancho actually is given a governorship, and he gets to rule a town. He actually gets his governorship for 10 days. He rules for 10 days, and everything's going well. He's enjoying it, and he even sends a letter to his wife about how he's become a governor, how she's a governor's wife now, how her children are the children of a governor, and they get really happy. They get really excited. He sends them back some money. He sends them back this green hunting coat that the Duke and Duchess gave him when they were on a brief hunting trip, and everything seems to be going fine, but eventually the Duke and Duchess stage an attack on Sancho's little governorship. It's Barastia is what it's called, the island of Barastia, though it's in the middle of land. It's not actually an island. And we just see as they attack, and Sancho takes the blunt of this because he's run over and all that. He gets trampled and he gets all beaten up, and then he decides he doesn't want to be governor anymore. He decided that he didn't want to be a governor and gave up on what he wanted, because he was falsely attacked and falsely placed in that position, and they just manipulated him because they wanted to be amused by it. And we also see eventually later on how they bring in Merlin, who reveals to Don Quixote that Dulcinea del Toboso has been enchanted, because when they went back, because in part 2 they actually end up going and looking for Dulcinea in the earlier portions of it, but they find a peasant girl, and Sancho's like, yeah, this is her, and he's like, she must have been enchanted or something. And then the Merlin ends up coming in, because Don Quixote told him about all of this, and he comes in and gets to talking to Don Quixote and Sancho, and there's like, yeah, she's enchanted, and if Sancho doesn't take 3,300 lashings, then she won't be disenchanted. And so this leads to quite some minor misfortune for Sancho, and we see, though, however, as eventually he actually does end up irking his duties, and we see as he kind of goes around with the task, kind of avoiding it, but like, so Don Quixote believes that Dulcinea will actually be disenchanted, and that his idea of Dulcinea will appear if Sancho undergoes these lashings. And it's just really, really sad, because Don Quixote believes all this. He truly believes it, and he's being manipulated for the amusement. Like, something so absurd obviously isn't true, but he is so deluded and so mentally unwell that he believes it. He believes one of his very good friends gets 3,000 lashings by his own hand, well, by Sancho's hand, then his beloved will appear, which is absurd. But, yeah, so we end up seeing this, and we see eventually they end up actually leaving the Duke and Duchess's house, and we also get introduced to an important character in part 2. I forgot to mention him earlier on, but his name is Sanson Carrasco. He is a scholar from La Mancha, who is the son of a wealthy man who had briefly housed Don Quixote and Sancho at the beginning of part 2, and he is a fan of Don Quixote's, but he is also trying to get Don Quixote to return to his home and be safe. And we see, as earlier on, he takes the role of the Knight of Spangles, and he attempts to fight Don Quixote, but he's ultimately beaten, and he's revealed to be Sancho Carrasco, and they believe he was under an enchantment and all that. But then, in the later part of the book, we see Don Quixote forays back out. He ends up going to Barcelona and going on some brief trips there. He ends up being on a boat briefly. And we end up seeing as Sancho Carrasco Sanson Carrasco ends up coming back during this under a different moniker, and he ends up fighting Don Quixote, and he actually wins this time. And during this, Don Quixote is like, oh, well, I can't be a knight for a year now, because that's what the battle was fought upon, was that Don Quixote wouldn't be a knight for a year now. He must return back to his land. So Don Quixote ends up agreeing to this, and he ends up being beat. So he ends up returning to his land, and during his time in his land, he ends up getting assuaged by the Duke and the Duchess again, and they come up with a woman who was supposed to be Don Quixote's lover, even though it was kind of false throughout all of this. And we see as like they make them believe that she's dead. Like, they make her corpse appear, and eventually they say that she is in fact not dead. And we also see things throughout this, like while they were at the Duke and the Duchess's place, there was this woman who was a dueña. Well, he said the dueña trip. The dueña arc was kind of stupid, because like it didn't have any like plot relativity, and it was just kind of a way to prove Don Quixote's stupidity and all that, and Sancho's and all that. And it shows Sancho arguing with some people, because yeah, we end up seeing this story of Don Quixote end up meeting with, I believe it's Dueña Rodriguez, and they end up talking, and she's like, yeah, my daughter was supposed to marry this dude, but he ended up not agreeing to do so and all that. And eventually Don Quixote ended up having a fight, but the man's like, you know what, I won't do this. So he ends up getting married to the woman, but he actually doesn't getting married to the woman, because the dude gets mad at him for not following his script. And yeah, so back to where Don Quixote was beaten, we see as he goes back, and like they see the body of Alistadora, and they're like, oh, she's dead, but she actually isn't dead. And then we learn about that, and we just slowly see more and more as they've just been manipulated over and over again. And eventually, ultimately, Don Quixote ends up returning home, and once he gets home, he goes down with a bad illness, and during this time, he comes to his senses. He realizes, I've done all this stupid stuff, and it was just because I believe that knight errant still exists. And we see as Don Quixote breaks down. Well, he doesn't break down, but his ideas and ideologies break down and crumble right here. It's a really sad thing to see, because he's been through all of this, developed so much by this, held his morals up so hard, because it's something that he loved so much. He loved this, so he wanted to be this. He followed his dreams, and he deluded himself so that he could be this. And then we just see as it slowly decomposes, as he becomes sick and grows closer to his death. And it's just a really sad thing to see. But yeah, on the topic of Sancho and his lashing, Sancho actually does end up doing his lashings when he lashes trees where Don Quixote can't see, but he can hear the noise, so he presumes it's going on. And because of these lashing, Don Quixote agrees to pay him, I believe it's 775 reals, because he wanted a quarter of what his punishment was worth. And so Sancho is able to do math, but he can't read. He actually calculates this out properly, but he's promised 775 reals by Don Quixote. And once they get back, he's like, I'll pay back and all that. But eventually the book ends up ending with Don Quixote dying. And it's just a really sad thing to see, because he broke down and lost everything before his death. He lost his valor as a knight by getting beaten, and then he lost his whole ideology at the end. So honestly, part 2 was just a lot, like, very sad. Also, I forgot to mention, this is going to be a little bump, but the dude who ended up getting lashings in part 1, he comes back in part 2, and he reveals to Don Quixote, yo, I didn't even get my money, and I just got more lashings because of you, and that's all that really ever comes with that. But yeah, like, part 2 is just really, really sad. And it sucks, because in part 1 we see Sancho as kind of this character of realism. We see that Sancho is slowly becoming aware, or at first he's just enamored with Don Quixote. He believes everything that's coming out of his mouth. He's eating up every word. But then as slowly more and more absurd things happen, he's like, yo, this isn't real. Don Quixote, man. You're not actually, there's no enchantments going on. There's no giants. There's nothing. There's just what there is to be seen. There's nothing beyond what meets the eye. But however, in part 2, we see a more logical and profound Sancho, but he's still as oblivious to the manipulation by the Duke and the Duchess as Don Quixote is. He never ends up really coming to terms with it, or accepting, like, what we see. And it's just really sad. It's a really sad case of dramatic irony, because we know that all this is manipulation, but they don't have a clue about it. And they presume it's all real, and it's just really disgusting acts by the Duke and the Duchess. Like, I know it's a little bit of an overreaction. It's still just goofy stuff happening. Like, nothing really bad happened to him, but, like, still, it's really sad to see. And, but yeah, like, I liked how Sancho was developing in the first part, but then the second part he just lost it. He lost his, I guess, development, because, I mean, yes, it was quite absurd to be presuming that they would be doing all this for some big show, but, like, it still sucks that Sancho didn't become wise to it, because it was quite evident at some points that it was just all a play by the Duke and the Duchess, but it's just never really discerned by Don Quixote and Sancho. And, I mean, I don't believe Don Quixote even came to this realization at his death that he was being manipulated throughout this entire adventure. And I know Sancho certainly didn't, because Sancho just kind of kept going along and all of that, and he kind of kept going with the idea of the lashings and all that all the way throughout, even though he didn't actually end up doing it himself. But yeah, like, it's just a really sad part in part 2, because it's just manipulation of mentally disabled people. If I were to consider anyone the antagonist in Don Quixote, it would be the Duke and the Duchess, because they're just manipulating those who don't know better, because they don't know better, because they want entertainment. And yeah, so this book, I would highly recommend it to anyone. It is not the greatest book of all time, as some people will say. It is really solid, though. Like, it is a good adventure novel. It will keep you entertained, especially the later parts of part 1 and, like, the middle parts of part 2. Because all of it's just really good. It's really good storytelling. Like, I gave it a very, like, brief and very crass and crude description of it, because there's a lot more intricacy to this book than there is. Like, I didn't even really brush on the philosophical discussion, because there are many philosophical and theological discussions in this book that are very valuable. I really enjoyed those, but they're kind of far and few between. I mean, not really few between, because there is quite a few of them, and especially in the second part, Sancho becomes more profound, and he starts discussing more and more stuff, and that's why I liked Sancho's brief stint as governor of Baristia, because we get to see more of Sancho's philosophy, and it's really good to see. But yeah, this book is absolutely a classic. It is one of the greatest of all time. Like, it's not in my top 10, but I can recognize this is one of the greatest books of all time. And I don't know if I would recommend reading it before War and Peace or The Count of Monte Cristo. I haven't read either of them, but I've watched a video on The Count of Monte Cristo. And I believe, personally, for the type of literature I enjoy, I would have liked The Count of Monte Cristo more. That's why I'm going to get it soon and read it. But this book is a really good adventure novel. Like, it honestly kind of reminded me of an anime in a way, because how it works is you kind of have each chapter focusing on its own little thing. Sometimes you have chapters following one storyline, but it's very rare for multiple chapters to follow one storyline. Most of the time it's just little adventures happening each chapter. And there's like over 120 chapters in this book. So we see a lot of those little adventures, and it reminded me of an anime. It kind of reminded me of like the original Dragon Ball. It's kind of going about doing things with a little bit more of an overarching story arc in some places. And that's why I really liked it. It did really just make me feel a sense of adventure and made me feel a sense of comedy. It made me laugh. This book is one of the... I honestly don't know if I've ever actually laughed at a work of literature. This book made me laugh because it was goofy. It was stupid. And like there's such absurd things happening, especially in part one. Part one was genuinely a comedic book. Part two has some comedy in it too, but part two is more sad, like I said, if you like consume it like I did. But yeah, that's, I mean, I can't really think of anything else more I have to say about Don Quixote. It was a really good book. I would highly recommend it. And I mean, I didn't even read the appendices and all that, but this book has a thick index and a thick glossary, so I would highly recommend the Penguins Classic cover or at least edition, because it's only $17 and you get this much. Like, it's a thick book. So I would highly recommend Don Quixote, and especially if you're into classical literature like I am, and even if you're into philosophy or theology reading, I would highly recommend it, because Don Quixote is a very theological man. And he's a very devout Christian. So you get to learn more about his like thoughts and all that, and some perspectives on certain topics at the time. So yeah, thank you for watching episode 46 of Shelf Review. And like I said, that's all I really have to say about Don Quixote. So thank you very much for watching.